The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota Territory, as smoke rose from what had once been the Blackfoot village of Standing Bear. Among the charred remains of teepees and scattered belongings, a lone figure knelt beside a small grave marker, his weathered hands trembling as they traced the carved symbols. Thomas Crowfeather, known to the U.S. Army as simply Thomas, had sworn that morning would be different. But as he stared at the fresh earth that held his younger sister's body, he realized that some promises were written in blood, and some betrayals cut deeper than winter winds through the plains. 3 days earlier, Thomas had sat in Colonel Morrison's tent, translating words that would seal the fate of his people, never knowing that his own heart would become the battlefield where loyalty and love would wage their final war. The autumn of 1876 had painted the Black Hills in shades of gold and crimson, but Thomas Crowfeather saw only the stark contrast between two worlds that claimed him. At 28, he possessed the weathered features of a man who had learned to navigate between the sacred grounds of his Lakota ancestors and the rigid protocols of the United States Army. His dark hair, cropped short in military fashion, still bore a single eagle feather, a quiet rebellion that Colonel Morrison tolerated because Thomas was simply too valuable to lose. "Thomas, we need you to explain the treaty terms clearly," Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had never questioned whether his cause was just. The colonel's tent smelled of tobacco and leather, foreign scents that had become as familiar to Thomas as the sage and sweetgrass of his childhood. "Chief Red Cloud needs to understand that this is their best opportunity for peace." Thomas nodded, though something cold settled in his stomach. He had been the Army's interpreter for 3 years now, a position that provided him with a steady income and protection for his sister Little Moon, who lived in the Lakota village just 20 miles north. The irony wasn't lost on him. He used his gift for languages to help his people communicate with the very government that sought to control them. As he stepped outside the tent, the crisp October air filled his lungs, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter. In the distance he could see the smoke from cooking fires in the Lakota camp, where families prepared for what they believed would be a negotiation for peace. His chest tightened as he thought of Little Moon, now 16 and more beautiful than the dawn breaking over the sacred mountains. She had their mother's gentle spirit and their father's fierce intelligence, and she trusted him completely to keep their people safe. The treaty documents felt heavy in his hands as he walked toward the meeting ground, a neutral space between the Army camp and the Lakota village. Each page represented hours of legal language that would be distilled into the fluid, poetic speech of his ancestors. But as Thomas had learned to read English with increasing fluency, he had begun to notice discrepancies between what the Army claimed and what the papers actually said. Chief Red Cloud waited beneath the sacred cottonwood tree, his presence commanding even in silence. At 64, the chief's face bore the wisdom of countless battles and negotiations, his eyes holding depths that spoke of losses too profound for words. Beside him sat other tribal leaders, men whose trust Thomas had earned through careful honesty and respect for their traditions. "My brothers," Thomas began in Lakota, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd, "the Bluecoats speak of a new treaty, one they say will bring lasting peace between our peoples." As he translated Colonel Morrison's opening remarks, Thomas felt the familiar weight of standing between two worlds. Every word he spoke in Lakota was a bridge between cultures, but also a potential betrayal of one side or the other. He had learned to navigate this carefully, softening the Army's more aggressive language, while ensuring the Lakota understood the serious nature of the government's intentions. But as the day progressed, and Thomas delved deeper into the treaty's specific terms, his unease grew. The document spoke of relocation to designated areas and temporary restrictions on traditional hunting grounds, language that sounded reasonable in English but would devastate the Lakota way of life when implemented. Still, he translated faithfully, watching as Chief Red Cloud's expression grew more troubled with each paragraph. "Tell me, Thomas," the chief said during a break in negotiations, his voice low and measured, "do you believe these words carry the promise of peace or the seeds of war?" The question struck Thomas like an arrow to the chest. Chief Red Cloud had always been able to see through surface words to the truth beneath, and now his piercing gaze seemed to penetrate Thomas's very soul. How could he admit that with each passing month, he trusted the Army's promises less and less? "I believe," Thomas said carefully, "that words on paper are only as strong as the hearts of those who honor them." Chief Red Cloud nodded slowly, understanding passing between them like a shared prayer. But Thomas could see the weight of leadership in the older man's shoulders, the impossible burden of making decisions that would affect generations of his people. That night, as Thomas returned to his quarters in the Army camp, he found a letter waiting for him. The familiar handwriting made his heart skip. Little Moon wrote to him regularly, her letters filled with news of the village and gentle teasing about his white man's clothes. But this letter felt different as he opened it, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. "My beloved brother," she wrote in the flowing script he had taught her, "the women are preparing winter clothing, and the children speak excitedly of the treaty that will bring peace. I know you carry a heavy burden in your work, but I want you to know how proud I am of you. You have become a bridge between our worlds, and I believe the spirits of our ancestors guide your words. There is something else I must tell you. Standing Bear, the son of Chief Red Cloud, has asked Father's permission to court me. My heart sings when I think of him, Thomas. He is kind and brave, and he sees the world with eyes that understand both tradition and the changes coming to our people. I hope you will give us your blessing when the treaty is signed and our peoples can finally live in peace. Your loving sister, Little Moon. Thomas set the letter down with hands that shook more than he cared to admit. Little Moon had found love, the pure, hopeful kind that believed in futures filled with possibility. Standing Bear was indeed a good man, someone who would protect and cherish her. The thought should have filled Thomas with joy, but instead, a terrible premonition settled over him like a winter storm. He walked to his small window and stared out at the Lakota fires in the distance. Somewhere among those lights, his sister was probably sewing beadwork for her wedding dress, dreaming of a life filled with love and children and the ancient rhythms of her people. And here he sat, in the camp of men who spoke of peace while their actions prepared for war. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of smoke and fire, of voices calling his name in 2 languages, neither of which seemed to offer sanctuary. Chapter 2, The Truth Unveiled. The morning of the 3rd day dawned gray and cold, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Thomas arrived at Colonel Morrison's tent earlier than usual, hoping to review the final treaty terms before the signing ceremony. What he discovered there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The colonel was bent over a map spread across his desk, speaking in low tones with Major Harrison, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness preceded him like a shadow. Thomas started to announce his presence, but something in their conversation made him pause behind the tent flap. The treaty signing is just a formality, Major Harrison was saying, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man discussing the weather. Once Red Cloud and his chiefs put their marks on that paper, we'll have legal justification for what comes next, and you're certain the Lakota won't suspect. Colonel Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. How could they? Their interpreter has been telling them exactly what we want them to hear. They believe they're negotiating for peace and limited land concessions. They have no idea they're signing away their right to exist as a sovereign people. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Through a gap in the tent fabric, he could see Major Harrison pointing to various locations on the map, including the exact spot where Little Moon's village lay sleeping in the pre-dawn darkness. Phase 1 begins immediately after the signing, Harrison continued. We'll move the families to the designated reservation areas, using force if necessary. Phase 2 eliminates any villages that refuse to relocate. We're calling it securing the territory against hostile elements. And if there's resistance? Morrison asked. Harrison's smile was cold as winter steel. There won't be any resistance after we make an example of the first village that refuses to comply. Sometimes peace requires a demonstration of strength. Thomas gripped the tent post to keep from falling. The treaty he had been translating for 3 days, the document that spoke of peace and mutual respect, was nothing more than a death warrant for his people. Every word he had carefully interpreted, every reassurance he had offered to Chief Red Cloud, had been part of an elaborate deception. Worse still, he realized that his own translations had been part of the trap. The army had been counting on his reputation for honesty to convince the Lakota leaders to trust the treaty's terms. His very presence at the negotiations had been a weapon turned against his own people. As the full horror of the situation settled over him, Thomas thought of Little Moon's letter, of her joy at finding love, of her faith in the peace that was supposed to come with the treaty signing. In a few hours she would be watching the ceremony with hope in her eyes, never knowing that she was witnessing the beginning of her people's destruction. Thomas backed away from the tent silently, his mind racing. He had perhaps 2 hours before the signing ceremony began. 2 hours to decide between betraying the army that had given him purpose and protection, or staying silent while his people walked unknowingly into catastrophe. The weight of the choice pressed down on him like a mountain. If he warned Chief Red Cloud and the other leaders, he would become a traitor to the United States Army, a crime punishable by death. His career, his income, his carefully built life would be destroyed in an instant. But if he remained silent, if he allowed the treaty signing to proceed, he would be complicit in the destruction of entire villages, including the one where his sister lived and loved and dreamed of a peaceful future. As he walked through the army camp, Thomas noticed details that had escaped him before. The unusual number of armed soldiers positioned around the perimeter, the supply wagons loaded with ammunition rather than the usual provisions, the way the officers' faces carried a tension that had nothing to do with standard treaty negotiations. The trap had been set with meticulous care, and he had been the unwitting bait that would lure his people into it. At his quarters, Thomas sat on his narrow cot and pulled out Little Moon's letter, reading her words again with eyes that now saw the terrible irony in every line. She was proud of him for being a bridge between worlds, never knowing that he had actually become an instrument of betrayal. She spoke of Standing Bear's kindness and the children's excitement about peace, never suspecting that Major Harrison was already planning to make examples of villages that wouldn't comply with forced relocation. The storm clouds that had been gathering all morning finally opened, sending rain against the windows of his quarters like tears from the sky itself. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to find some path forward that wouldn't require him to destroy either his own future or the lives of everyone he loved. But as the minutes ticked by toward the treaty ceremony, one truth became unavoidably clear. There was no choice that wouldn't cost him everything. The only question was whether he would pay that price in his own blood or in the blood of his people. Rising from the cot, Thomas walked to his small mirror and stared at the face looking back at him. The man in the reflection wore the clothes of a U.S. Army interpreter, but his eyes held the soul of a Lakota warrior. For 3 years, he had tried to be both, convincing himself that he could serve two masters and betray neither. Now, as rain continued to fall outside and the hour of decision approached, Thomas Crowfeather finally understood that some choices could only be made with the heart, regardless of what the mind counseled or what the consequences might be. He had been living as two people for too long. It was time to discover who he truly was. Chapter 3. The Point of No Return. The treaty ceremony was set to begin at noon, but Thomas arrived at Chief Red Cloud's lodge while the morning mist still clung to the ground. The chief emerged from his dwelling, with the quiet dignity that had made him a legend among both his people and his enemies, his weathered face showing no surprise at Thomas's early arrival. "You carry the weight of difficult words, my friend," Red Cloud observed, gesturing for Thomas to sit beside the small fire outside his lodge. "I can see it in the way you hold your shoulders, as if the sky itself presses down upon you." Thomas looked into the flames, watching them dance like the spirits his grandmother had taught him to recognize in every living thing. "Grandfather," he said, using the term of respect reserved for the wisest elders, "what would you do if you discovered that your trusted friend had been lying to you? Not from malice, but because he himself had been deceived." Red Cloud poured tea from a small pot, the aromatic steam rising between them like incense. "I would ask myself whether this friend chose to continue the deception once he learned the truth, or whether he found the courage to speak honestly despite the cost." The simplicity of the answer cut through Thomas like a blade. There it was, the fundamental question that had been tormenting him through the sleepless night. Not whether he had been deceived, but what he would choose to do now that he knew the truth. "The treaty," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire, "is not what I have been telling you it is." Red Cloud's expression didn't change, but Thomas saw something flicker in the older man's eyes. Not surprise, but a deep sadness, as if he had been expecting this moment for some time. "Tell me," Red Cloud said simply. And so Thomas did. He told him about the conversation he had overheard, about Major Harrison's plans for forced relocation, and the destruction of resistant villages. He explained how the treaty's language had been deliberately crafted to sound reasonable, while actually stripping away all the rights and protections the Lakota believed they were securing. Most painfully of all, he revealed how his own reputation for honesty had been used as a weapon to convince the tribal leaders to trust the Army's promises. As he spoke, Thomas watched emotions play across Chief Red Cloud's face, anger, sorrow, and something that might have been pride. When Thomas finished, silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring. "How long have you known?" Red Cloud asked finally. "Since this morning. I came to you as soon as I could." The chief nodded slowly. "And what will this knowledge cost you?" Thomas looked toward the army camp, where he could see soldiers beginning to gather for the ceremony. "Everything. My position, my income, probably my life. They'll call me a traitor. And your sister?" The question hit him like a physical blow. If he was executed for treason, who would protect Little Moon? Who would ensure her safety if the villages were attacked? His betrayal of the army wouldn't just cost him his life. It might cost her everything as well. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to save her." Red Cloud stood and placed a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder. "My son, you have already made the choice that honors your ancestors. Now you must trust that the spirits will guide the rest." As if summoned by the chief's words, a figure emerged from the morning mist, standing bare, Red Cloud's son, tall and strong with the kind of quiet confidence that drew people to him like a flame. Thomas had always respected the young man, but seeing him now, knowing that Little Moon loved him, Thomas felt a fierce protectiveness rise in his chest. "Father, the soldiers are asking about the ceremony's delay," Standing Bear said, then noticed Thomas's distressed expression. "Brother, you look as if you've seen death walking." "Perhaps I have," Thomas replied, then looked between father and son. "Standing Bear, I need you to promise me something." The young man settled beside the fire, his attention focused completely on Thomas. "Speak. If something happens to me, if I don't return to the village, I need you to protect Little Moon, not just because you love her, but because she may be in danger due to my actions today." Standing Bear's eyes sharpened. "What actions?" Thomas looked to Chief Red Cloud, who nodded gravely. With growing alarm, Standing Bear listened as Thomas explained the true nature of the treaty and the army's plans for the aftermath. By the time Thomas finished, the young warrior's hands were clenched into fists. "We must warn the other villages immediately," Standing Bear said, rising to his feet. "If they're planning to attack after the signing—" "No," Chief Red Cloud interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority. "If we suddenly cancel the ceremony, or evacuate the villages, they'll know their deception has been discovered. They'll simply move to Phase 2 immediately, and we'll lose any chance to prepare properly." Thomas felt sick as he realized the impossible position they were all in. "So what do we do?" The old chief was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking wisdom from the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would echo through generations. "We sign the treaty," he said quietly, "but we will be ready for what comes after." Thomas stared at him in horror. "You'll sign it, even knowing what it really means?" "I will sign it because I know what it really means," Red Cloud replied. "A leader sometimes must appear to walk into a trap in order to spring one of his own." Standing Bear looked between his father and Thomas, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You have a plan. I have the beginning of one, but it will require great sacrifice from all of us." Red Cloud turned to Thomas. "Most of all from you, my son. You must continue to play your role as interpreter until the very moment we're ready to act. Can you do that?" The request felt like a knife twisting in Thomas's chest. Having finally found the courage to reveal the truth, now he was being asked to return to the deception, to stand beside Colonel Morrison and Major Harrison, and continue facilitating their betrayal of his people. But as he looked at Standing Bear, the man who would protect and love Little Moon, Thomas understood what was being asked of him. This wasn't about returning to the lie. It was about using the lie as a weapon against those who had created it. "I can do it," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "But I need to know that Little Moon will be safe, whatever happens." Standing Bear clasped Thomas's shoulder with the grip of a brother. "She will be under my protection from this moment forward. I swear it on the spirits of our ancestors." As the three men stood together beside the dying fire, Thomas felt something shift inside him. For 3 years, he had been a man divided, trying to serve two masters and belong to two worlds. But now, in this moment of ultimate choice, he finally understood who he truly was. He was Lakota. He was a son of the people who had taught him that honor was more valuable than life, that protecting the innocent was more important than protecting oneself. The uniform he wore, the salary he earned, the safety he had built for himself, all of it paled beside the simple truth that his people needed him. The storm clouds were breaking as Thomas walked back toward the army camp, revealing patches of blue sky that seemed to promise better days ahead. In a few hours, he would stand beside Colonel Morrison and translate the words of a treaty that both sides now knew was a lie. But this time, he would be serving only one master, the people who had loved him before he learned to doubt himself, and who would love him still after he found the courage to come home. The ceremony bell was beginning to toll across the valley, calling all parties to the moment that would determine the fate of thousands. Thomas Crow Feather squared his shoulders and walked toward his destiny, finally at peace with the man he had chosen to be. Chapter 4. The Ceremony of Lies. The ceremonial ground had been transformed into a theater of deception. Rows of chairs faced a long table where the treaty documents lay waiting, their pages rustling slightly in the autumn breeze. Army officers in their finest uniforms stood at attention along the perimeter, while Lakota leaders in their ceremonial regalia took their places with the dignity of men who had faced death before and found it less frightening than dishonor. Thomas took his position at the center of it all, the human bridge between two worlds that were about to collide with devastating force. His army uniform felt strange against his skin now, like a costume he was wearing in a play where he had forgotten his lines. But as Chief Red Cloud caught his eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, Thomas remembered his true role in this performance. Colonel Morrison called the assembly to order, his voice carrying across the gathering with practiced authority. "We are here today to witness the signing of a treaty that will bring lasting peace between the United States government and the proud Lakota nation. This agreement represents a new chapter in the relationship between our peoples, one built on mutual respect and shared prosperity." As Thomas translated these words into Lakota, he felt each syllable like acid on his tongue. But he forced himself to speak them clearly, knowing that Chief Red Cloud and the other leaders needed to hear the lies in their full, flowery glory in order to prepare for what was coming. Major Harrison stepped forward with the first copy of the treaty, his cold smile never wavering as he began reading the terms aloud. Article 1. The Lakota Nation agrees to relocate to designated reservation lands where they will be provided with housing, food, and education for their children. Thomas translated mechanically, watching the faces of his people as they listened to promises that would never be kept. But now he also noticed other details. the way Chief Red Cloud's youngest warriors had positioned themselves near the edges of the gathering, the subtle hand signals passing between the tribal leaders, the fact that several of the women and children seemed to be missing from the usual ceremonial attendance. They were already implementing Red Cloud's plan, whatever it was. As the reading continued, Thomas caught sight of a familiar figure among the Lakota observers. Little Moon had come to witness what she believed would be the beginning of peace, her face radiant with hope as she stood beside her friends from the village. She had dressed in her finest duskin dress, the one decorated with the star pattern their grandmother had taught her to sew, and her long black hair was adorned with wildflowers. Standing Bear was beside her, but Thomas noticed that the young warrior's attention kept drifting to the tray line beyond the ceremonial grounds. Following his gaze, Thomas spotted something that made his blood run cold, the glint of sunlight off rifle barrels among the trees. Major Harrison had positioned snipers around the perimeter, ready to eliminate any Lakota who tried to flee if the ceremony went badly. The trap was even more complete than Thomas had realized. Article 5, Major Harrison continued, his voice taking on a more ominous tone, states that any violation of this treaty by members of the Lakota Nation will result in immediate forfeiture of all protections and considerations herein outlined. This was the clause that would justify the attacks on the villages. Any act of resistance, any failure to comply with impossible demands, would void the entire treaty and give the army legal cover for what they were planning to do anyway. As Thomas translated these words, he saw understanding flicker in Chief Red Cloud's eyes. The old chief had heard similar language before, in treaties that had cost his people their ancestral lands piece by piece over the decades. But this time, Thomas realized, Red Cloud had been expecting the betrayal. The signing ceremony itself was a moment of profound sadness disguised as celebration. One by one, the Lakota chiefs approached the table and made their marks on the treaty documents, each signature sealing what they all now knew was their people's doom. But there was something else in their faces as they signed, not defeat, but the grim determination of warriors preparing for battle. Chief Red Cloud was the last to sign, his weathered hand steady as he wrote his name in the careful English script Thomas had taught him years ago. As he set down the pen, he looked directly at Thomas and spoke in Lakota. His words meant for the army officers, even though they couldn't understand them. "Tell them," Red Cloud said quietly, "that a true warrior knows when to appear weak in order to become strong." Thomas felt his heart skip as he realized what the chief was telling him. But before he could respond, Colonel Morrison was calling for the ceremonial photographs, gathering all the participants together to commemorate this historic moment of peace. As the photographer arranged his equipment, Thomas found himself standing between the two groups, army officers on one side, Lakota leaders on the other. It was a perfect metaphor for the position he had occupied for 3 years, and would continue to occupy for whatever time remained to him. The camera's flash seemed to freeze the moment in time, an instant when two civilizations stood together in apparent harmony, neither revealing the warfare that was already beginning in their hearts. As the ceremony concluded and people began to disperse, Thomas felt a hand on his arm. Little Moon had approached him, her face glowing with joy and relief. "Brother," she said in Lakota, keeping her voice low, "I am so proud of what you accomplished here today. You've helped bring peace to our people." The irony was so profound that Thomas felt physically ill. His sister was thanking him for facilitating what might be the destruction of everything she held dear. But as he looked into her trusting eyes, he realized that this moment, her happiness, her faith in the future, was exactly what he was fighting to preserve. "Little Moon," he said carefully, "I need you to promise me something, anything, brother. Stay close to Standing Bear over the next few days. Don't travel alone, and if he tells you to leave the village quickly, don't ask questions. Just go." Confusion flickered across her features. "Thomas, you're frightening me. What's wrong?" Before he could answer, Standing Bear appeared at her side, his arms sliding protectively around her waist. The look he gave Thomas was heavy with meaning. He understood what was coming, and he was ready. "Your brother is just being careful," Standing Bear told her gently. "These are uncertain times, and it's wise to be prepared for anything." As Thomas watched the two of them together, his sister and the man who loved her, he felt a strange peace settle over him. Whatever happened in the coming days, Little Moon would be protected. Standing Bear would keep his promise, even if it cost him his own life. The sun was setting as Thomas returned to his quarters in the army camp, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed prophetic. Tomorrow, Major Harrison would begin implementing Phase 1 of his plan, and the carefully orchestrated deception would give way to the brutal reality of forced relocation and military occupation. But tonight, for a few hours, Thomas could hold on to the image of his sister's smiling face and the memory of Chief Red Cloud's unshakable dignity. He had betrayed his uniform and his salary, and his carefully constructed life as a bridge between worlds, but he had not betrayed his heart. Chapter 5, The Reckoning. Dawn came too quickly, bringing with it the sound of marching boots and the rattle of supply wagons being loaded for what the Army called relocation assistance. Thomas stood at his window, watching soldiers prepare for operations that would begin within hours, and felt the weight of every choice he had made over the past 3 years. A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Thomas, report to Colonel Morrison's tent immediately," came Sergeant Willis's voice through the wooden barrier. Thomas dressed quickly, his hands moving automatically through the familiar routine of donning his interpreter's uniform. But as he fastened each button, he wondered if this would be the last time he would wear the clothes that had defined his identity for so long. Colonel Morrison's tent was crowded with officers studying maps and discussing logistics. Thomas recognized the locations being marked. Every Lakota village within a 50-mile radius, including the one where Little Moon was probably helping prepare the morning meal, unaware that her world was about to change forever. "Thomas, excellent timing," Morrison said without looking up from his maps. "Major Harrison needs you to compose a message to be delivered to all the Lakota villages. It needs to explain the immediate relocation requirements and give them exactly 12 hours to comply." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. 12 hours. More than generous, really. Major Harrison interjected, his voice carrying its usual cold satisfaction. "They can take essential belongings and livestock, but everything else stays behind. We'll be providing transportation and temporary housing at the reservation." "And if they refuse?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Harrison's smile could have frozen fire. "They won't refuse. You'll make sure they understand the consequences of non-compliance." As Thomas took the written orders, his hands trembled slightly. The document was even worse than he had feared. Families would be separated, with men sent to one facility, and women and children to another for processing. Personal property would be evaluated for security purposes before being returned, a euphemism for theft that wouldn't fool anyone. Most chilling of all, the document made clear that any form of resistance would be met with appropriate military response. "I need you to deliver this message personally to Chief Red Cloud first," Morrison continued. "His cooperation will encourage the other villages to comply peacefully." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. As he left the tent, he heard Harrison telling Morrison about the special arrangements being made for villages that didn't meet the deadline. The casual tone in which they discussed destroying entire communities made Thomas's stomach turn. The ride to Chief Red Cloud's village took 2 hours. 2 hours during which Thomas rehearsed the words he would need to say and tried to prepare himself for what he might find when he arrived. But nothing could have prepared him for the scene that greeted him as he crested the hill overlooking the valley. The village was nearly empty. Where yesterday there had been dozens of lodge fires and the sounds of daily life, now Thomas could see only a handful of teepees and a few elderly people moving slowly between them. The majority of the population, including the warriors, the women, and most of the children, had vanished as completely as morning mist. Chief Red Cloud emerged from his lodge as Thomas approached, the old man's face showing no surprise at the sight of the Army interpreter arriving with official documents. "Grandfather," Thomas said as he dismounted. "Where is everyone?" "Safe," Red Cloud replied simply. "Your warning gave us time to prepare." Thomas looked around the nearly deserted village, understanding beginning to dawn. "You evacuated them. I sent them to join our cousins in the Northern Territories, where the Army has no authority yet. It will take them several days to reach safety, but they are under the protection of our finest warriors." The relief Thomas felt was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by new worry. "What about Little Moon? Did she go with them?" Red Cloud's expression grew gentle. "Your sister chose to remain. She said she would not leave while her brother was still in danger." Before Thomas could respond, a familiar voice called his name. Little Moon emerged from one of the remaining lodges, her face lighting up with joy at the sight of him. But as she drew closer, Thomas could see the worry in her eyes. "Brother, Standing Bear told me something terrible is happening. He said I should go north with the others, but I couldn't leave you behind." Thomas felt his heart break a little more. Even now, faced with mortal danger, his sister's first concern was for his safety. "Little Moon, you have to go, today. The Army is coming to force everyone onto reservations, and anyone who resists will face the consequences," she finished for him, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Standing Bear explained everything. "But Thomas, what about you? If you've been helping us, they'll call you a traitor." Before Thomas could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the valley. A cavalry unit was riding toward the village, moving at a pace that suggested urgency rather than routine patrol. Thomas recognized the officer leading them, Captain Bradley, one of Harrison's most trusted subordinates. "Thomas, get behind me," Red Cloud said quietly, but Thomas shook his head. "No, grandfather. I came here as their interpreter, and I'll face them as such. But first," he turned to Little Moon, taking her hands in his. "Sister, I need you to promise me that whatever happens next, you'll go north with Standing Bear. Don't look back, don't try to help me, just go and live the life you deserve." Tears were flowing down her cheeks, but she nodded. "I promise, brother. But Thomas." "I know," he said, pulling her into an embrace that felt like goodbye. "I love you too." Captain Bradley and his men reached the village center, their horses kicking up dust that seemed to symbolize the destruction they brought with them. The captain's face was grim as he surveyed the nearly empty settlement. "Thomas, what's the meaning of this?" Bradley demanded. "Where is everyone?" Thomas stepped forward, his interpreter's training taking over even as his heart pounded with fear. "Captain, I was just about to deliver the relocation orders to Chief Red Cloud. As you can see, many of the villagers have already departed to gather their belongings from seasonal camps." It was a lie, but delivered with the same professional competence Thomas had brought to his work for 3 years. Captain Bradley looked around suspiciously, but seemed to accept the explanation. "Chief Red Cloud," Bradley said, addressing the Lakota leader directly despite knowing the man spoke little English, "you and your people have 12 hours to report to the reservation for relocation. Any who fail to comply will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." As Thomas translated the ultimatum, he watched Red Cloud's face carefully. The old chief listened without expression, then responded in Lakota with words that carried the weight of finality. "Tell the captain," Red Cloud said, "that I am an old man who has seen many promises broken. I will not be moved from the land where my fathers are buried." Thomas found himself at the moment of ultimate choice. He could translate Red Cloud's words accurately and watch the old chief be arrested or killed on the spot. Or he could lie one final time, but this time in service of truth rather than deception. "Chief Red Cloud says," Thomas told Captain Bradley, "that he will need time to gather his personal effects and perform the proper ceremonies before leaving sacred ground. He requests permission to depart at sunset, in accordance with his people's traditions." Bradley looked uncertain. The answer wasn't exactly compliance, but it wasn't outright refusal either. "Very well, sunset. But if he's not at the reservation by midnight, we'll come back for him." As the cavalry unit rode away, Thomas felt Little Moon's hand slip into his. "That was the last lie I'll ever tell in their service," he said quietly. Chief Red Cloud placed a weathered hand on Thomas's shoulder,